Prince Elector Ernst of Saxony and his brother Duke Albert III had a rather significant problem on their hands, and unfortunately it was one only a letter to the Pope could resolve. The brothers had had enough with the dry, unappealing stollen that was being served at their tables. The Church's edict forbidding the use of butter and sugar during the fasting period of Advent had left the traditional fruitcake an experiment in culinary disappointment, as its ingredients of flour, oats, water, and turnip seed oil left everything to be desired. Worse yet, because oil was expensive and in short supply in the northern kingdom of Europe, known for its richness in butter and cheeses, the people who could afford a bit of fat during the Advent had been relegated to the use of oil made from the seeds of turnips. This made the fasting days, which amounted to almost half the year, a rather large ordeal in areas where nutrition severely dropped without the use of dairy and meat restricted during these days. And frankly, the brothers were just over their peculiarly turnipy fruitcakes. So, a letter was delivered to Pope Nicholas V, requesting that they be allowed to use butter in their stollen in place of the revolting turnip oil. The Pope's quick response was a denial of their request, having clearly never tried stollen made from turnip oil. At this point, stollen hadn't even gotten as far as to add the delicious marzipan, but if it had, undoubtedly it would have been banned as well. The brothers royal were not that easily dissuaded, and continued to press each new pope with a letter appealing for the use of butter in their bread. Until, as fate would have it, 5 popes and 40 years later, Pope Innocent VIII issued what is known as the Butter Brief, a papal decree overturning the ban on butter and allowing for its use in the place of the dreadful turnip seed oil without penalty to the kitchens of the Prince Elector and his family alone. And while the family of the prince happily toasted their buttery bread, Pope Innocent clarified that others were also welcome to use butter, but they were required to pay a butter tax, a 20th of a gold coin every year for the privilege, which would go to help with the construction costs of the Freiburg Cathedral. Understandably, the butter scandal continued to develop, with some historians suspecting that a lack of butter was a factor for Martin Luther, who lived smack dab in the middle of the butter controversy, and who wrote with passionate indignance that the church thought eating butter a greater sin than telling a lie, blaspheming, or indulging in impurity. Luther's thoughts on the matter of the church and butter were not a secret, and soon an unhappy Luther could be found nailing his 95 thesis to the wooden door of a church in his hometown of Wittenberg, Germany. By 1527, Saxony as a whole had enough of their dairy-free existence during the Advent season and decided to leave the Catholic Church and become Protestants. There was probably a bit more to it than butter, but this definitely didn't help matters. The fruitcake at the heart of the controversy dressed up and became the sweet rich bread we have today, with its candied peels and marzipan center, and the entire thing coated in a thick powder of soft white sugar. The fight for the soul of the German fruitcake relative was definitely worth it. Meanwhile, this little kerfuffle over the fruitcake was not the real beginning of the story at all. Apparently, that honor belongs to ancient Egypt, where a little loaf made of honey, figs, dried fruits, and nuts is considered the first sighting of fruitcake in the historic record. The little cake was such a hit that the living tucked it away in the tombs of their departed loved ones in case they needed a snack in the afterlife. 3,500 years later, archaeologists would unearth one of these tombs in Thebes, Egypt. The fruitcake, which was still distinguishable, was completely untouched. Even the departed were not that hungry. Down the road, the ancient Romans improved upon the recipe shared by the Egyptians by adding barley mash, pomegranate seeds, pine nuts, raisins, and honey wine to their version, and declared their creation to be their favorite food when heading into battle. The clever Romans named their little cake satura, from which we get the word satire. Purely incidentally, and presumably after kicking back a few of these bars, the ancient Romans also helped create an entire literary form around the word. Coincidence? Maybe. But, like the Roman Empire, time marched on, and so did fruitcake. During the Middle Ages, the Crusaders journeying between Europe and the Middle East broke out the Roman satura fruitcake recipe to supply them with a source of energy and endurance while they made their pilgrimage. And the Crusaders, powered by fruitcake they had made from stale bread, honey, spices, and a fruit-meat combination, wore a trail between Europe and the Middle East that allowed an increase in trade, providing Europe with an abundant and varied selection of dried fruits and nuts with which to bake up more fruitcake. But the ingredients for the cakes remained extravagant and thus limited their use to special occasions, crusaders, and the upper echelons of society. In the 14th century, King Richard II's master cook whipped together a collection of recipes with a dish called figgy being a favorite. The wrapped and boiled mixture of ground almond, wine, and figs is presumed to be the predecessor of the infamous figgy pudding, with its easily recognizable dome shape and steamed or boiled texture, eventually moving roving bands of English carolers to scavenge the countryside, demanding their wealthy neighbors produce one immediately and bring it out here to the lyrical mob. Oh, and Merry Christmas. But by the 16th century, the world was really cooking, and various countries across Europe reimagined the fruitcake into candied fruit-filled breads, cakes, and puddings, thanks to the colonization of the Americas, which had made sugar a plentiful commodity. Now, instead of simply throwing all that dried fruit into their cakes, fruit peels and fruits could be preserved by candying them to within an inch of their lives and then adding them to the baked goods. And it soon worked its way into the storied English holiday staple plum pudding, a distinctive version of fruitcake. However, the process of making fruitcakes was understandably labor-intensive, and the result so decadent that most often it was saved for special occasions, such as the Christmas dinner table or a royal wedding. When Queen Victoria and Prince Albert tied the knot, the guests were served a baked fruitcake, and instantly fruitcake was elevated in the eyes of the Victorians. Victoria and Albert's wedding fruitcake must have been a pretty high proof, as a slice of it sold at auction in 2016, 176 years later, for £1,500. The fashionable and much emulated queen loved the fruit and nut-studded little cakes so much that she was said to eat it regularly at tea, and the Victorians, responsible for much of the iconography around Christmas, securely tied the little cakes to their Christmas traditions. Confidentially, tea each afternoon might be a step too far for most, but yearly seemed a reasonable concession. By this time, fruitcakes with their sugar-rich batter and their candied fruits were getting a pretty good reputation to balance out their questionable beginnings. These homemade cakes had a little something going for them. Namely, they were wrapped in a cloth that had been saturated in alcohol, once they were cooled, and then sealed into an airtight container to age. The alcohol permeating the cake killed off bacteria, yeast, and mold, and allowed the fruitcake to become practically immortal. It also made it possible for an entire industry selling commercially manufactured cakes to rise up and spread its festive terror throughout the English-speaking world. When Robert Falcon Scott packed up his Huntley and Palmer fruitcake to make his Terra Nova expedition to Antarctica, one can presume he left the calorically dense food at the Cape Adare base purely by accident. The fruitcake was discovered over 100 years later with the tin badly rusted and decayed, and the festive little cake inside still wrapped in its paper, suspiciously looking and smelling edible. Almost. Ironically, Scott died of exposure and starvation on the return journey. In America during the Revolutionary War era, British colonists who brought their traditions to the New World called the fruitcakes muster cakes, as they sent the men who had been called to muster into the military on their way with the dense boozy treats. You can get through just about anything with a few bites of rum-soaked spice cake, I suppose. To our modern tastes, undoubtedly jaded by the amount of refined sugar and flour we consume yearly, fruitcakes seem antiquated, heavy, and unnaturally stuffed with garishly colored candied fruits, giving it a similar connotation as meeting a clown outside the circus, just a bit offsetting. The traditionally heavy fruit-filled cakes are often spoken of with horror, even by those who have never been brave enough to try a slice. And perhaps Johnny Carson voiced all our suspicions most succinctly when he joked that there's only one fruitcake and people just keep passing it around. I'd say there's pretty good evidence that there's more than one cake floating around, as most of us know exactly where a tin of fruitcake is sitting this very moment, guiltily tucked at the back of the pantry, still happily aging in its original tin, awaiting the day when all other food is inaccessible and survival is dependent upon it. Then perhaps the virtues of fruitcake will once again shine. anything is possible. We hope you enjoyed today's Advent video, and that if you did, you'll take a moment to like, comment, and even share it with your own friends and family, as all of it helps our channel continue to grow. Now, go pass on that fruitcake you got a few years back and keep this tradition alive. It's going to survive with your help or without it anyway. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you next time.